Why target Sri Lanka's Christian minority? There's sadly a long history of suicide attacks in the country's past, but the coordinated bloodbath on Easter Sunday is unprecedented. Hundreds of men, women, and children killed. And just to make certain the whole world was watching, suicide attacks also targeted hotels popular with Westerners. What is the point? It's been 10 years since the country has seen this scale of violence since a brutal civil war ended with the crushing of Tamil separatists. How will Sri Lanka react now? And more broadly, why the alarming rise of religious intolerance throughout the region, with politicians too often pandering to Hindu extremism in India, radical Islam in Pakistan and Bangladesh, and ethnic cleansing in the name of Buddhism in Myanmar? One of the first measures taken in Sri Lanka was to shut down social media. On that point, how to deal with the technology that's providing a bullhorn sometimes for dangerous zealots. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the Sri Lanka attacks. With us, Budi Attada, is Sri Lanka's ambassador to France. Thank you for being with us.
Pleased to be here.
We want to welcome as well filmmaker and producer Pradipan Ravindran. Your next film, Soundless Dance, which is due out when?
Yeah, it's end of the year. It will released.
End of 2019.
Yeah.
From Glasgow, freelance journalist Tasneem Nazir, your column entitled "Sri Lanka's Christians Were Left Unprotected Far Too Long," published in this Monday's edition of The Guardian. Welcome to the show. And from Oslo, Iselin Frinzenlund, associate professor at the Norwegian School of Theology. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, we saw the explosion of a van this Monday near St. Anthony's Church in Colombo, one of those targets. And that sent fresh jitters as bomb squads worked to defuse devices. More detonators were found, 87 of them, 24 arrests, 7 suicide bombers. They targeted in all 3 churches, 4 hotels. Charlie James has a look.
Another blast in Sri Lanka. In Colombo, a van near St. Anthony's Shrine exploded as a bomb squad tried to defuse devices inside. Just Sunday, scores of worshippers were killed inside the church, one of 3 targeted across the country during Easter Mass. The string of near-simultaneous bombings also struck hotels, killing tourists at the breakfast buffets. In Colombo, the Shangri-La, the Cinnamon Grand, and the Kingsbury were hit, as well as another hotel opposite Sri Lanka's National Zoo. No one has claimed responsibility yet, but the government says an Islamic extremist group is behind the attacks.
The organization is Tawfiq Jamal, no? National Tawfiq Jamal. This is a local organization, but we don't know whether they have been linked to the outside.
This is the deadliest violence the country has seen since its civil war ended a decade ago. Outside hospitals, victims' relatives are still anxiously waiting for news. Most killed were Sri Lankan, but the bodies of at least 39 foreigners have been recovered. The president has declared a nationwide emergency effective at midnight, which will give authorities power to detain and interrogate suspects without court orders. Police have already arrested 24 people. As the search for those responsible continues, the capital will spend a second night under mandatory curfew.
Ambassador Atadua, we're all trying to grapple with the question of why.
We are as shocked as you are, and our whole country is in pain. And there are a lot of Sri Lankans who live here in France, in Paris. Last night I met some of them, and some of them cannot eat. They have no appetite. They cannot get out of the house. They have no drive. You know, they are so saddened. What a shocking thing! On Easter Sunday at the church to lose your lives like this. You know.
We see in that report the health minister. He has to reach for a piece of paper because the group is so obscure. He wants to make sure he gets the name right. This isn't a household name. This group.
You're right. We are not officially the investigations are still continuing, looking deep into that one, and Sri Lanka has asked for international help through our government official channels. So they are still investigating the whole issue. So it's difficult to say all the answers at this time.
Yeah, difficult to say at this point. And we heard the minister say, we don't know if they had help from the outside. We're wondering how did this, if it is this group, how did they go from low-level acts of harassment to suddenly these well-coordinated suicides?
Those are the signs. Well coordinated, you can see clearly, and multiple locations, same time or within one day. So these are all resemble certain well-trained people, who had done this.
Pradipan Ravindran, we heard the ambassador mention last night a vigil. The Eiffel Tower went dark. What's it been like for people here who are far away, of course, from Sri Lanka?
Yeah, in a way, we unfortunately we used to counting death, past our life. So yeah, in a way, it's shocking because it's very shocking because after 10 years gap, it's we starting to count the death again. So it's mean last 10 years somehow we believed, even though we had a lot of wound comes from this 30 years civil war. Particularly people who lives in France, Tamil people, they somehow came with this trauma, and they thinking how they can go behind this healing process. And this 10 years process somehow is healing process because somehow they can return to country and visit, and they somehow believed in it. Little by little, it's take time, no? So it's taken they taken the time, but this tragedy is unbelievable, and we didn't expect it, of course, as ambassador mentioned. But some news coming from Sri Lanka, it's shocking for us because some sources says that there is the intelligence reports already released about this kind of extremist group exist, and they targeting this kind of major attack, and it's 2 weeks ago. So I really don't know why government didn't take any action, and there is a clear miscommunication between Prime Minister and President. We could clearly see that, and so that's a main concern for us. And is it how much we gonna cost in the future?
I want to pick up on that point because it's an important one. But before I do, Tasneem Nazir, did you share this surprise, this shock, 10 years after the end of the civil war, to suddenly have suicide bombings back in Sri Lanka?
Oh, yes, I definitely do share that sentiment of shock, and there's a shared grief because we never expected that 10 years after the Civil War we would be faced with such a tragedy. And I think that there's been a lot of, attacks recently on churches and the Christian community, and we really need to stand united in solidarity. As a Sri Lankan myself, I have got family out there and friends, and I just pray for all those who've lost their life right now. But it's really important that we stay united in the wake of this tragedy.
You say you were married near one of the sites that was hit.
Yes, I was married in Sri Lanka in the Hilton Hotel, which was quite near to Cinnamon Grand Hotel. And we've visited these hotels, many times on our holidays, our family holidays to Sri Lanka. During my sister's wedding, for example, we were in and out of Cinnamon Grand. So I think Sri Lanka means a lot to the whole, community, no matter what religion or faith you believe in. We all want to come together and support, the rebuilding of churches, stand united with our fellow countrymen at such a difficult time.
Yeah, it was as you rightly point out, it was churches that were hit and also hotels. Danish media, for instance, reports that 3 of the 4 children of that country's richest man are among the victims. He's a fashion retail mogul, Anders Poulsen, who also owns a large amount of real estate in Scotland. He'd been vacationing with his family. Iselin Frydenlund, what do you think is the message here and from these attacks? Is there a way to make sense of it?
Right. Well, first of all, I would like to express my deep expressions of condolences to all the peoples of Sri Lanka and everyone affected by these dreadful attacks. It fills me with such a deep sorrow. I've been traveling back and forth to Sri Lanka for the last 2 decades, and my heart is in Sri Lanka too. I think, yeah, like my fellow guests in the show said, I mean, it fills us with shock and surprise. We didn't expect this kind of violence in Sri Lanka at this time at all. And I think what I would really would like to emphasize is that it really shows a new pattern. I mean, it's really not following the legacies of religious violence in the past that we have seen in Sri Lanka. And it doesn't really make sense for one religious minority to attack another religious minority. One could perhaps expect that people would attack symbols of the state or symbols that were connected to Buddhism. And by that saying that, well, we feel oppressed by a singular dominated state. But by attacking these Christian spots and these cosmopolitan hotels, because these hotels are really global spaces in a way, you really communicate to a international community, and you draw their attention to Sri Lanka in ways in which that if you had attacked a ministry or a government minister or a Buddhist symbol,
is that to infer? Is that to infer, Iselin, that this could be orchestrated from abroad?
Well, I mean, no one has claimed responsibility, right? And we really do not know who actually were behind this. And I really appreciate the caution shown by the Mr. Ambassador here. And I think it's really, really important that we show that kind of caution. But yes, I mean, we don't know of any other groups in Sri Lanka at the time that would be able to carry out attacks of this scale, really. So yes, it is quite plausible to think that it must have received aid from the outside.
Made from the outside, again, we don't have right now a claim of responsibility. We do have already, though, and we heard Pradipan Ravindran point to it, some finger-pointing going on over perhaps security lapses due to the political crisis in Sri Lanka. Cabinet members blamed the lingering effect of a constitutional crisis where the president, Maithripala Sirisena, ousted Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe back in October. The Prime Minister has since been reinstated by the Constitutional Court, but he's not been allowed back into security meetings. This is a tweet that was sent out by the Telecoms Minister late on Sunday, in which he says some intelligence officers were aware of this incident. There was a delay in action. Serious action needs to be taken as to why this warning was ignored. And we heard the health minister wondering aloud about security lapses and how this relatively unknown radical group could carry out all these attacks on their own.
We don't see that only a small organization in this country can do all that. There is all, we are now investigating about the international support for them. And there are other links where they can produce, how they produce the suicide bombers here and all these things.
Is there the feeling, Ambassador, that the political crisis that we've seen since October in Sri Lanka may have in a way, made it easier for a group to get past security lapses?
Actually, let me explain to you how Sri Lanka. I need a few minutes to explain because soundbite will not justify this answer of this one. Sri Lanka.
We might get interrupted by the
Right.
break, but go ahead.
Sri Lanka has been always the pioneer in the South Asian region. For the last few hundred years, we had the first radio station, first telephone, first mobile phone, and first country to become the open market country. While then my neighbors were former Soviet Union supporters. So one of the reasons that we had a difficult time, the price we paid to become a free country, economic freedom, is this last conflict we had, because there were international influence by other groups. So we will not be a successful country with the open market system, which is your way of living in France and USA and so on. So with that background, with that pain, here we are still a democracy. And when our politicians have a dispute, they went to the Supreme Court and they settled it. So this is a sign of maturity in democracy rather than a conflict. So when it comes to this issue with the President and Prime Minister, constitutionally, President has the authority and the power of the Defense Ministry. So that is why it's under President. It's very clear in the Constitution.
All right, we're going to pick up on that point.
Right.
We'll be right back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. Sri Lanka and the world reeling after the unprecedented attacks on the Christian community there and on hotels. 7 suicide bombers. A death toll that nearing 300. With us is Sri Lanka's ambassador to France, Budi Atadu-Uda. Also with us, filmmaker and producer Pradipan Ravindran. Welcome back as well to freelance journalist Tasneem Nazir, who's written a column in The Guardian entitled Sri Lanka's Christians Were Left Unprotected for Far Too Long. She's with us from Glasgow. And from Oslo is Lynn Freindenlund, who teaches at the Norwegian School of Theology. Ambassador, just before the break, you were pointing out that the security matters are the remit of the president, not of the prime minister. And since we have this power-sharing deal right now with the president from one party and the prime minister from another, that's why we've had this, well, what the cabinet calls miscommunication or lack of when it came to the alarm being raised over security risks.
Actually, to me, it's very clear command path. For military, defense ministry is under president, and the cabinet of ministers are from another party, and the prime minister is from that party. So my point is, president has a separate election. We have a presidential election, and then the parliament has a separate election, and out of the parliamentary, the winners of the parliamentary election, the members of the parliament, out of that, whoever got the highest majority gets to appoint their prime minister. So that's why the prime minister and the ministers are from another party. But these are two different roles. Clearly, the presidency has its own standing with a separate election.
Are there signs, despite the crisis, that there is a coming together? The president and the prime minister were at each other's throats up until recently. After what's happened, is the nation coming together?
I think the media is sensationalizing a little bit, but on the other hand, these leaders are very experienced leaders in the country, and they have a clear vision. There can be different in the vision from the prime minister's vision and the prime president's vision, but they're all good for the country. So, to me, what happened here, I just want to point out one more point with my fellow countryman Pradeepan over here. So, saying that there is a lack of communication or between the Prime Minister's office or the security
Well, that's the
reports.
accusation we heard from those cabinet
Right,
members.
Right. But what I just want to point out at this time, even in 9/11 Pentagon incident, there were miscommunications had taken place. Unfortunately, this was a mistake, and many people's lives lost. And but in the real world, mistakes happen. But nobody can be forgiven for this kind of situations. But on the other hand, it's not only limited to Sri Lanka.
Yeah, Tasneem Nazir, this is so unprecedented what we've witnessed on Easter Sunday that how could you predict something like this? Your thoughts on whether or not the call could have been heeded to stop this?
I think the call definitely could have been made. I mean, I think that the government really needed to take the issue seriously. Just 2 days before this attack, a bishop in the town of Anuradhapura called Bishop Siri Pereira had voiced his concerns after his church was attacked by a group of youths. And he also mentioned that these cases were not isolated. So one has to question why the government haven't done enough to protect these minority groups. I mean, the Christians have been targeted, Muslims have been targeted, and although we as a nation, we want to come together and we want to stand with one another, Buddhist, Hindu, Christian and Muslims all as one, we need the government to be aware and to take action when crimes are reported to the police. And only then can we further investigate and hold those perpetrators to account in the eyes of the law.
At this point, I'd like to bring in France 24 correspondent Mandakini Galat, who's in Colombo. Mandakini, it's nighttime. There's a curfew on. There's been a shutting down of certain social media for cooler heads to prevail. You were describing to us earlier what a somber mood it's been this Easter Monday where you are.
Absolutely. The streets have been completely deserted here in the capital, Colombo, and we were able to go out earlier today and speak to some of those communities that were affected, the Christian community in particular, those who live around the St. Anthony's Church, which was the first to be attacked. And it's just, the community is left completely devastated. We met people who'd lost their children, their brothers, their sisters. We spoke to the head priest, and he said the church was packed full to capacity. But about the country and the city, we've entered the second consecutive night of curfew. The streets are completely deserted. There's an eerie silence. They're only allowing traffic to move towards the airport, and then too, it's rather difficult. So really a very difficult moment for this country, and particularly for the communities that were affected by those attacks.
All right, we mentioned it at the outset. There have been shows of solidarity coming in from around the world, including from neighboring India, which, by the way, is in the throes of a general election. Prime Minister Narendra Modi spoke at a rally on Sunday in the Rajasthan city of Chittorgarh.
Militancy is so terrifying that every day, somewhere in the world, it paints the soil with the blood of innocence. Today, whatever happened in Sri Lanka, India stands in unity with the people there. In this hour of crisis, India is ready to help Sri Lanka in whatever way possible.
Now, that show of solidarity expressed by India's Prime Minister. However, just recently, the president of Modi's own party, the Hindu nationalist BJP, compared illegal migrants from neighboring Bangladesh, who are predominantly Muslim, to termites.
These infiltrators are like termites on the land of Bengal. They are a threat to the security of the nation, and they are snatching away the livelihoods of our poor people. The Bharatiya Janata Party is determined to throw these infiltrators out, and we will surely do it.
Mandakini Galat, you're usually based in Delhi. Do you get the sense that political discourse is becoming more inflamed, particularly when it comes to religion?
Absolutely. I mean, there's no denying this, and this is true across South Asia. But in India, particularly right now, because of the election, there's increased rhetoric, and there's a lot of attacks on religious minorities, both vocal and actual violence. Now, what we just saw there is just plain hypocrisy. You have the Prime Minister who sends out this message of solidarity, and then you have the BJP's president who's constantly saying things along the lines of, we're going to remove these infiltrators. They've announced a plan that they'd like to carry out a countrywide survey and identify who is not an Indian citizen, and that's largely Bangladeshi Muslims. So there is a lot of talk of religion in this election, particularly because keep in mind the Prime Minister Modi is seeking re-election. The last time round in 2014, he rode to victory on the promise of creating millions of jobs, bringing economic prosperity. It doesn't help his cause that India is in the grips of its worst unemployment crisis. And with people asking questions about that, it's it works in their favor to shift the narrative towards Hindu nationalism. And that's really what's going on in India.
Iselin Frindelund, your thoughts on why this is happening throughout the region, the growing religious intolerance. There was a study published last year that shows that intolerance, by the way, is not just in South Asia, it's worldwide. But in South Asia, on top of intercommunal tensions, there's certain state actors working to prevent conversions to other religions. We can show the graphic there. We've seen recently an election in Indonesia where the the president to get reelected, picked as his running mate a hardline cleric. When a case comes to Sri Lanka, though, what's the mood? What's the trend?
Well, generally, I would say that it shows concern over mobility of people as well. I mean, this is part of globalization issues as well, that you have people moving across borders. We communicate across borders very rapidly, which means that concern in one place is picked up for perhaps completely different issues in another place. And I'm really, really concerned on how this incident will play out for Muslims, not only in Sri Lanka, but also in India and also in Myanmar. Right. So this language about, that points to dehumanization of religious minorities and how this is played out in electoral politics. It will play most probably out in the Indian elections, and we have elections coming up in Sri Lanka and in Myanmar in 2020. So this concern over Muslim minorities now can potentially be misused for all sorts of political purposes. But again, I really would like to say something about the long history of Muslims in Sri Lanka, which is really a story about relatively peaceful coexistence for the last 1,000 years. We don't have a tradition of political Islam. We don't have a tradition of Muslim insurgencies in Sri Lanka. And I don't want us to forget that this really comes as a surprise and a shock to everyone. And it shows this internationalization of religious divisions and how this is localized.
Tasneem Nazir, you agree?
Yes, I completely agree that there are many people who are using the tragedy to politicize and feed their own political agendas, and this is completely unacceptable at a time when victims are grieving and we all want to come together. As Sri Lankans, I mean, these are human beings. We have to be united in humanity and not use this tragedy to spur tensions, because there is that sense of fear amongst the various different communities and minorities in Sri Lanka. And what we don't want is people to feel that they can't step out of their house and support their fellow countrymen out of fear that they're going to be reprimanded or blamed collectively for something that we totally condemn and denounce.
Let me ask you, Pradipan Ravindram, listening to the point made there by Iselin Frindelund, is there growing intolerance, or is it simply that because people can move around more easily, those who are radicalized can achieve their aims more easily?
For me, in Sri Lanka, try to understand a little bit, I wanted to say one thing, that the minorities, or Sri Lankan minorities, had a kind of insecurity from independence, because so much of constitutional crisis happened, and so much of all the time the state always stayed as a Buddhist state. So the minorities always had a problem with that. So this is our past from the independence. So from there, this kind of insecurity, force us. We seen how it's forced people to radicalized, or
But when you had a Tamil insurgency, it wasn't characterized along religious lines. Tamils are of different religions.
Yeah, it's quite complicated, because Tamils are Hindus and Christians and Muslims too. But once Muslims came out from Tamil group, because after Tamil Tigers throw them out from northern east. So from there, we see the Muslims came out from the Tamil ethnic group. So we accepted it, that they have the right reason. So that's why it's the minority is always affected by someone, and then everybody have their,
So fast forward to 2019, what needs to be done so that everyone stays together on this and that the intolerance doesn't grow?
Yeah, simply state should be accept that religionless state. They should go.
It's
that
not
is the only
case?
No, it's not the case.
How so?
Because the religion always, the state always stay behind the Buddhist state. They representing as that. That's a main concern for us. That's never happening from long time.
Ambassador Atadua, right now, what are your thoughts on how the country can come together?
I think this is a very serious point that Pradeep, my fellow countryman Pradeepan mentioned. This is a very bad perception that going around all over the world in some news media, I noticed. But it's absolutely not true. The Buddhists, the Sri Lankan government, constitutionally, every religion, every ethnic group has equal rights. For example, in my own embassy here in Paris, when we do any kind of a Sri Lankan festival or anything, we invite all the religious leaders, and we have ceremony by each with their own culture, and that's a practice for us. Then our government has mandated all the government employees should learn Tamil language. Every year they increase the bar of a competency. In fact, I have to send one of my very important employees during very important meetings, send back to Sri Lanka for her to take that exam. So the government is making very serious efforts, many ways. It's very easy to run a headline with different things, but it's absolutely not true. And Sri Lanka's government has enough capability to protect all the people. And I want to link this to the Facebook situation also. Recently we had another dispute between Muslim and we had a national issue with Muslim young two boys and a Sinhala Buddhist driver, and they converted this into a Buddhist-Muslim issue. All what happened was these kids were overtaking a vehicle, and then the other vehicle who was driven by another driver overtook again. They got into a conflict, and they had a typical youth having a little extra energy. So this converted into a religious issue through Facebook. So government banned the Facebook for a day or two, and diffused thing, put security all over the mosques and temples and so on. It was finished. So this time, it has nothing to do with the Buddhists. There's no evidence. In fact, Buddhist monks and all the religious leaders are asking country to maintain peace and stay together. It's the national word by all the religious leaders in Sri Lanka.
Mandakini Galat, what's been the reaction to this suspension of social media we've seen since the attacks?
Well, there's a growing realization that social media has been used to spread misinformation, disinformation, and worse, violence. In the last year alone, we've seen how rumors on WhatsApp and Facebook have been used to incite violence against the Muslim minority here. So, on the whole, Sri Lankans are happy to follow this ban. There's a growing realization that this has been instituted for a good reason, and people here have really just gone along with it, and we haven't heard so many complaints.
And how long will the ban last, Ambassador?
Until we get the situation under control. And because this Facebook is not controlled by anybody, it's just a free media. You know, it's important for us to save lives. It's important nobody gets hurt. Even one death is too much at the cost of Facebook or any other social media. That's the position of the government.
Iselin Frindelund, your thoughts on this, on the role of social media? We talked about it enough when there was the Christchurch attacks last month.
No, it's on the one hand, I mean, I can really understand and appreciate why the government tries to do something and shut social media down. Sri Lanka does have a rather horrific past of, postings of hateful content on Facebook, and how this is linked to mob violence, particularly against religious minorities. So I assume that the shutting down is linked to, trying to stop what have happened in the past. But on the other hand, it's of course a huge dilemma, because you also curb the people's possibilities of communicating with each other, to connect and to discuss these serious issues. So it surely is a dilemma. And I would also just like to add, if I may, a comment to Mr. Ambassador here, that yes, I appreciate the official stance that one is protecting all minorities in Sri Lanka. But it also is true that there is a record of rather serious attacks on religious minorities in Sri Lanka that the government, for various reasons, has been incapable of stopping. And the violence against Muslim communities in Nalutkama in June 2014 is the gravest example we have of this. So it is important to remember that belonging to ethnic or religious minorities in Sri Lanka has been rather difficult, not only during the war, but also after the end of the World War in 2009.
Iselin, very quick word.
Yeah. You have to put it in the right context in this one. When you say about Sri Lanka, we came from a very bloody conflict. People couldn't go in one vehicle. Children and parents used to go in differently just to survive. And here we have brought peace, and people can go to school, youth can have education. It's a whole different level we are in now. And our democratic institutions slowly maturing. So I'm sure we could do better, and I am sure it will get there because we have the drive and the desire.
Ambassador, I want to thank you. I want to thank Iselin Frindelund for being with us. From Oslo, I want to thank as well Tasneem Nazir in Glasgow, Pradipan Ravindran. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois. So
yeah.
You just touched on it there, the whole issue of social media and being blocked in Sri Lanka in the aftermath of those deadly attacks. Lots of discussion about that online. We'll just take a look at some elements. This is cnet.com. Sri Lanka blocks social media after the deadly Easter explosions. They, in their article, embed quite a lot of reactions. This was one of the initial communications from the Prime Minister, saying that he strongly condemned those attacks, but then a call for people to avoid propaganda propagating unverified reports and speculation online and saying that the government was taking immediate steps to contain this situation. Now, others were lamenting that, I suppose, online. You had one comment here saying, if I don't reply to your messages, it is because WhatsApp and Facebook appears to have been shut down in Sri Lanka. Now, Twitter wasn't shut down. It is used a lot less than other social networks, but in particular, Facebook is very widely used for people just to communicate. So there was the concern that people couldn't inform their families, for example, if they were safe. So that was certainly one of the downsides of the blocking of social media. Netblocks.org, which tracks the disruption of media online, was looking at the extent of social media that were blocked. Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, YouTube, Viber, Snapchat and Messenger. As we said, Twitter wasn't. Now, the pros and the cons, this is an article in The Guardian looking at that. For the journalists writing this piece, the dangers of social media in the aftermath of an attack like this are greater than the advantages. And I suppose Christchurch would be the most recent example, where live content, live video of a massacre was broadcast before Facebook could actually get on top of it and manage the situation. So it is very complex. This is Kenneth Roth of Human Rights Watch sharing an article from the New York Times. He points out that the Sri Lankan authorities had warned Facebook multiple times recently after viral rumours, calls for violence circulating online, and that there had been these repeated warnings, but that the company had failed to respond until the government shut down access. This is what's unusual about this particular instance is that the Sri Lanka's decision to block the social media, it happened before any social media inspired violence was known to have taken place. So this was a preemptive action taken by the government, I suppose, on the basis that there had been previous examples of the social network failing to manage misinformation online. This is a quote from Sanjana Hatotua, who is a Colombo-based researcher, partners with Facebook sometimes, and he said basically Facebook has floundered under the sheer volume of content and the limitations of its algorithms. Also because the languages in Myanmar and Sri Lanka aren't spoken anywhere else in the world, there is a difficulty getting on top of it and controlling the spreading of false information. So basically blocking it is one solution. Now, a lot of people do have hesitations. They're expressing hesitations about that as well. This is a Colombo-based sci-fi writer, and he says, look, in a country with tight government controls on traditional media, social media has actually been a boon for us. It's something that really is helpful for the spreading of free information, even if you also have misinformation. And he says you have to make an effort to understand that violence in Sri Lanka began before social media, the internet, and to a large extent, much of race hatred is still fueled by print media, by the traditional media, where there is often a bias. So it's not a very simple picture, as many of these people are pointing out. One final comment from this BuzzFeed journalist: news media are controlled in Sri Lanka, and journalists are under a lot of pressure. So people seeking legitimate information rely on social media. VPNs also are widely used, so hate groups can get on these platforms anyway.
All right, many thanks for that, James Creedon. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.